Again, Russia is at it again. They see that we've got this crisis over coronavirus. So what do? They decide, well, no, we're not going to cut production. We're going to keep producing the way we are. And Saudi Arabia responds by cutting prices and the oil market collapses. The oil market collapsing is very important because this is the worry about defaults and bankruptcies. You've got a lot of shale players out there who have a certain number that they base their business on. They say, you know, we need crude to be $50 a barrel, $60 a barrel in order to continue putting the rigs out there and continuing operations. Well, at this price, you're going to see a lot of canceled rigs. You're going to see a lot of oil companies pull back on their spending and on their investments into drilling. And that, on the one hand, is exactly what Russia wanted. Russia wants to kill the industry, the shale industry, and that's why it's coming back here and saying, no, we're not going to do any production cuts. Also, on the other side of the coin, oil is seen as an indicator for an economic slowdown. The more demand you have for oil, that is indicating that the economy is doing well. That means people are flying, people are building homes, etc. Lots of economic activity. When prices go down, it's the opposite, that perhaps that business is drying up and we're close to a recession.
We are expecting some movement on behalf of the president. The motorcade will be departing to Mar-a-Lago, arriving Palm Beach International Airport, wheels up to Orlando, then to Sanford, Florida, en route to Longwood, Florida, a private residence there where the president will be participating in a roundtable with supporters. So we could possibly hear from the president shortly. Obviously, we would be looking for any White House reaction to the stock market sell-off. Connell McShane from the Fox Business Network also joining us now. Connell, what are you seeing and hearing?
I really want to follow up on what Maria's saying there about the oil market because it's such an interesting point. I was actually thinking this morning about August of 2018. I spent a lot of time in West Texas then, in the Midland area, and at the time we were doing a story about the booming economy in that particular part of the country. And when you see oil prices go up and you see a boom in the shale industry, you go down to West Texas and you will see traffic like you can't believe. We paid not a joke, you know, something like $400 a room for a hotel that was not a high-end hotel. These people were doing crazy amount of business where people were flying in, you know, for the week. They fly in and they stay literally in 10 cities to do their work in the oil industry. Then they fly home to their families in other parts of the country. That's during a boom period. Now here we are in 2020, and that's why the geopolitics of all of this is so important. And what is Russia trying to do? What is Saudi Arabia trying to do? When I interviewed those people, I'm sure you talked to them as well, Maria, in the oil industry, what they went back to a number of times, because they'll get hit by environmentalists and the like, it would say, what is fracking beneficial and all this kind of thing. One of their main answers is that it makes us safer. They will say, and they will make the argument that the country is more energy independent with a strong shale oil industry.
That's right.
Obviously, Russia knows that. Obviously, Saudi Arabia knows that. So the opposite is also true. If our shale oil industry is not as strong, then our country is less energy independent. And that's a big story to watch here.
And that's what Russia wants to change.
Exactly right.
That's exactly what Russia's doing. And I just want to point out, for those companies that can actually survive this, that will not default and will not go bankrupt, on the other side of this, this is a huge stimulus for the economy. One analyst writes, for every $1 decline in the price of oil, it equates to $100 million a day, or $36.5 billion a year in lower energy costs. So ultimately it does become a positive, but we're in a moment in time right now that these energy companies, these shale companies that we're talking about, could actually default and go bankrupt. That is exactly what Russia wants to see.
And that consumer benefit, don't you think, is a little bit less prevalent right now? Now, that longer term, obviously, you're right.
That is long term.
But in the near term, if we can't convince people to fly, if we can't convince people to travel and drive, then the price of, whether it's oil or jet fuel or whatever the case may be, is less beneficial than it will be over the longer term.
Which is why Congress and the administration are talking about a fiscal response here.
I want to know what John Scott noted right at the top of the hour, near the top of the hour, is that the sell-off has come off of its worst levels of the session.
Yep.
The S&P 500, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the NASDAQ, they had sold off that 7% threshold that triggered the circuit breaker. And then we saw the entire U.S. stock market halted for 15 minutes. Trading then resumed. I suppose, Maria, you could make the case that these circuit breakers are working. This is an efficient system. Remember, these are new circuit breakers that were put in place, I believe, February 2013 after the May 2010 flash crash. Right. The circuit breakers that were in place did not prevent or did not lead to an orderly sell-off, and the selling was actually exacerbated. So one could make the case that this circuit breaker system having triggered it at level 1 and now resumed trading, that it's working.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it is, because sometimes you just have to stop to actually assess the situation to see if there are any other buyers to offset the sellers here. And again, I have to keep putting out this optimistic note. It is an incredible time to find opportunities if you're in this market for the long term. It's also an incredible opportunity to take out a mortgage. Right. To borrow at these levels is just incredible.
We just got some jobs numbers that were really positive,
and they were blowout.
Well.
273,000 jobs created for the month of February. Wages going up. We've got a good backdrop, and thankfully we do, because we will need a cushion going into the rest of the year. Things are going to slow considerably. You're talking about zero earnings growth for a number of companies in 2020.
Circuit breaker system is, to me, it's even more important now than it would have been at any point really in our history. And I know we've had terrible days in the past. The 87 crash when the market went down more than 20% in a single day. But what's striking about this decline, and people kind of try to compare it to the financial crisis in 2008, so much different than that. But what's striking about this particular movement in the market, things happen so fast now that you can have a move just like this of the 7% as we saw at the open, of the limit down in the stock index futures last night, that having a system in place that allows you to say, all right, let's take 15 minutes is helpful, because otherwise you never get that time out in this environment. With electronic trading and algorithmic trading, things happen just so fast that having a timeout system does make a lot of
John
sense.
Scott,
I don't have the market expertise that you two do, actually all three of you do in particular, but I'm just curious about, how much of this is caused by the fact that the markets are closed on the weekends, and traders go home and they read the headlines and they hear about coronavirus and they see all these things getting canceled and they just kind of freak out.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a cycle that feeds on itself. But the headline of Russia fighting with the Saudis and Russia saying that it is not going to cut production was really the trigger. And that would have been the trigger at any time. That was the trigger for the collapse in oil prices. And the stock investors do not want to see oil collapsing 20 and 30%. It could be an indicator of recession or a sharp slowdown. And it also could, as I mentioned earlier, create defaults and bankruptcies in a sector that is so important to this economy, that is the shale boom. Again, exactly what Russia wanted. So this is as much a foreign policy story as it is a stock market story.
100%. Yeah. And when things happen quickly, good news suddenly becomes bad news. So is it good for us as consumers that interest rates are so low? Yeah, of course. But when rates go this low so fast and get to a level that just seems ridiculous to people when they look up and see almost 0% interest rates, then you start to worry. So that was the debate over the Federal Reserve. What can the Federal Reserve do about this? I know Maria made this point before I got here, but it's the right point. There's not as many tools left. So when you start cutting rates, as they did last week, and you cut them by half a percentage point, people say, well, how bad are things? As opposed to, oh, you're here to help us out. I just want to get this in here because
I mentioned that the president would be leaving shortly. We are told that he is on board Air Force One. He did not make any comments as he was boarding the plane. But there was a phone call, a conference call that was just held with Alex Azar, who's about to join us on this program moments from now. Portion of it was on background. A portion was on the record. This part was on the record, responding to the stock market plunge this morning. He said so that there's a very aggressive whole of government approach at the state level, the federal level, and the notion that we can't do our day jobs and work on this very serious issue is absurd. We're taking coronavirus incredibly seriously, and our teams, our public health agencies are actively working as we sit here and also try to reform the entire healthcare system. So we also have a phone call, obviously, into the White House. We're waiting on specific reaction from President Trump to this sell-off and what is next with the coronavirus. But Maria, it's that, and there's the live picture of Air Force One, the president taking off, but it's also oil as well. Final thoughts?
Absolutely, and I just want to say that the corporate sector is so leveraged right now. It's a good reminder in terms of the amount of debt that some of these companies are facing, because when you are in a squeeze the way we are right now, where oil prices have dropped 30% and where, earnings growth is going to be nil for 2020, that's when the debt really becomes a major problem. So looking looking at the corporate sector and how leveraged it is right now, that's where the real weak spots are going to be in terms of bankruptcies.
As you saw Air Force One taking off there with the president on board, the latest tweet coming from the president before takeoff there, Connell, was the president saying the best decision made was the toughest of them all, which saved many lives. Our very early decision to stop travel to and certain parts of the world, tweeted the president. He also said, great job being done by the VP and the coronavirus task force. Thank you.
Other tough decisions still to be made, and I think that's part of what people are thinking about, although I agree with Maria that the oil story has certainly made things much worse today. And those tough decisions include what we will do in major cities around this country if the virus continues to spread, decisions that have already been made in other countries, and people watch that. They see what's happening in Italy. They know that Dr. Fauci's alluded to the fact that that is at least on the table and being thought about down the line here. So I think people are looking ahead now, not at the decisions that have already been made, but the decisions that are still to be made.
Kyle McShane, Maria Bartiromo from the Fox Business Network. Really appreciate you staying with us throughout this breaking news this morning. And John, as you mentioned, the Dow off of its lows of the session after that trading halt. Trading resumed, and now it's off 5.8%. Back to you.
Rebounding about 400 points from its lows of the day. Fox News alert now, a cruise ship with about 21 people, at least 21 people on board, testing positive for the coronavirus. That ship is preparing to dock today in California after several days just sitting dead in the water off San Francisco. Some 3,500 passengers and